This is the Mindful Crinks, and I am your host, Ron Purser. I really enjoyed speaking with Martin Parker about his bold book, Shut Down the Business School, What's Wrong with Management Education, published by Pluto Press. Yeah, you heard that right. Shut down the business school. Bulldoze it over, flatten it. Sure, sounds a little hyperbolic, but this is a serious book, not some frivolous rant. Even as far back as 1995, Martin Parker was criticizing the higher education, what he dubbed the McUniversity, the title of an article he published in the journal Organization. Soon thereafter, his book, Against Management, came out, which landed him a chair position at the University of Keele, a unique department of management composed of interdisciplinary scholars, which became a radical hotbed. I think what makes this conversation unique is that Martin and I are both professors of management. We've both been housed within a business school at our respective universities. Martin is now at the University of Bristol in the UK. When he was the chair at Keele, he spearheaded the formation of a fringe subdiscipline in the field of management known as critical management studies. We share a lot in common in that neither of us have an undergraduate or graduate degree in business or management. And as marginal outsiders, so this conversation is very personal. There has been a great deal of criticism of business schools over the years. External critiques, such as from the Carnegie Commission. But what's quite remarkable, that much of this criticism has come from insiders. Prominent professors from such places as Stanford in the U.S. and McGill in Canada. We reflect on the ironies of this, as Parker himself has been rewarded and promoted for his provocative articles and books. He has been biting the hand that feeds him for years, and that hand, the B School, has seemed to develop a natural immunity to such infectious assaults. We briefly explore such topics as the history of the B School, the problems with MBA programs, the various calls for reform that have fallen on deaf ears, along with why B schools have been fiercely loyal and beholden to teaching managerial capitalism, and the inevitability of the corporatized form as the one best way, even the only way, to organize. As our conversation evolves, Parker tells us straight up why the student as customer and such marketized notions as student satisfaction are problematic. This insidious trend has been part and parcel of the corporatization of the university, where knowledge itself has become that which is purely utilitarian, relevant, and which can be marketized and sold. Parker explains to us how B schools have functioned as the loudspeaker for managerial capitalism, where management has now come to be seen as absolutely necessary to all organizations, a claim of expertise which essentially denies that others have the capacity for managing their own affairs. Finally, we come to the core questions. What should business schools be for? Given the meta-crisis of climate change, gross global economic inequities, deteriorating mental health, and so on, why are B schools accomplices to these meta-problems rather than their solution? Parker advocates that B schools, given their tremendous reach and leverage, need to be shut down and reinvented as schools of organizing, where students can be introduced to a wide range of approaches to organizing, and where the curriculum mandates that every discipline and course incorporates a fundamental imperative towards carbon reduction. I hope you enjoy our lively and animated discussion, as well as a few rants. Martin Parker, welcome to the Mindful Cranks.
Thank you very much.
Well, I read your Against Management some 20 years ago, and that's when I discovered this little rogue group called Critical Management Studies, and all the cool kids seemed to be in the UK, and it was quite a breath of fresh air, quite a lifeline, because I've always considered, like you, I've considered myself an outsider to the field of management, kind of a misfit.
Yeah.
Even though, my doctorate was in organizational behavior and organizational development, my real scholarly interests were in sociology and philosophy, religious studies, depth psychology, cultural
Wow.
studies.
Okay.
And then I discovered, just looking at some of your work going back to 1995, that you wrote an article on the McUniversity.
Oh, yeah.
The McUniversity. And so I said, wow, we do share a lot in common. And so I think we could start maybe by, if you could tell us a little bit about your formative periods when you joined the University of Keele.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess it sounds like you that for a long time I've worked in schools of business and management, but always felt like a stranger in a strange land, really. My first degree was in anthropology, my second degree was in cultural studies, and my third degree was in sociology. And I worked in a sociology department for a couple of years before finally moving to this rather odd management department at Keele University. And most of the people there didn't have training in business management. At that point in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, there weren't really that many business schools in the UK. And so the growing business schools that did exist were having to recruit from sociology, psychology, economics, history, and so on. So we were a fairly interdisciplinary bunch. And I guess many of us didn't really feel like we belonged. Which gave us a fantastic license in a sense, and it's still kind of true in the UK in that business schools are still relatively new things, and it's only more lately that they are being populated by people who've been educated within business schools. But for much of my career, they've basically been a cowboy town for me, in which there were no rules. There, a whole bunch of people who are bringing their disciplinary baggage with them. We just used to play. And since many of us were, left, green, feminist, socialist, and so on, then I guess those kinds of political sympathies got played out in the way that we understood our work, our research, and our teaching.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of liberty, even in the field of management, isn't there? In terms of groups like management, spirituality, and religion group, and there are a lot of fringe elements.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that management in the UK, I don't know whether people would say this in the States, is not really a discipline. It's a field. And if you define it broadly, it's basically a way of talking about the constitution of our modern world, isn't it? So there's not much that's off limits, really. And you can, I think, you can roam fairly widely across the social sciences, arts, and humanities, and still have some way of getting it, of making a claim that what you're doing is relevant to business management.
Yeah. Well, one of the other key issues that you raise, I read your reflection on Against Management in the journal Organization recently, and this is something I also shared with you in terms of that. One of the key issues that you raise is that academics, in general, I mean, not just management, but particularly management, maybe, have been caught in a status game where you're rewarded for publishing peer-reviewed articles in academic journals, usually behind paywalls, or university academic presses where the books are way too expensive and they end up sitting mainly on university libraries collecting dust. That academics are basically talking to each other with really not a lot of significant impact. And even worse, there's a delusion or fantasy that even those academics who believe their writing is critical or political is not the same as actually doing something or really having an influence on the public. So, and you're saying that in this article that you're reflecting on that. Here you were publishing books and articles with very provocative titles like Against Management and Shut Down the Business School. Yeah. Yet, quite ironically, you were getting rewarded and promoted for biting the hand that was feeding you. And could you say something about that? That irony is quite remarkable, that it didn't seem to even faze the mainstream business school.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of things to say about that. I mean, one would be that you might call it irony. A simpler version would be hypocrisy, wouldn't it? So, that, right. And that's certainly what I've been accused of by many people, so sucking enthusiastically at the teat of the business school at the same time as I was, trying to disembowel it. That's an ugly metaphor. But basically, that sounds like a fairly hypocritical position. And I just want to acknowledge that, really. Mm-hmm. In another sense, I suppose that the business school complex globally and particularly in the UK is now so big, so powerful, that in a way it kind of doesn't matter what people like me and my ilk say. It's the squeaking of a mouse, which is not going to disturb the trajectory of this particular elephant, is it? It's going to carry on doing what it does. And indeed, in some ways, I've felt sometimes that I can be paraded as an example of the liberal tolerance of the business school itself. Here's right. Professor Parker. He even thinks the business school should be closed down. Haha, right. Which is not a rhetorical position. The book doesn't argue that just for the sake of, showing my bum in public or something. It's intended to be a serious political point, but effectively it's not one that's landed anywhere. And indeed, since I arrived at the University of Bristol 5 years ago, they've now set up a business school, despite the fact they appointed me on, partly on the back of that book. So, nobody's listening, Ron. I mean, apart from your lovely listeners, I hope.
Yeah, I have a quote here that from two critical management studies insiders that I'm going to read it. It's really juicy. Described the business school as, quote, a cancerous machine spewing out sick and irrelevant detritus justified as practical and glossed up as business relevant. It extorts fees from the middle and upper classes so that it can stamp their offspring with a passport to corporate sleaze, mortgage slavery, burnout, stress, overwork, and repression. That's quite an indictment.
Not too bad then.
Well, this is really quite fascinating, as you're saying, that these critiques were coming mostly from insiders, not just outsiders. And these dissidents in CMS also did very well for themselves, actually. Yeah. Almost like an academic cottage industry of sorts.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I mean, no, it's kind of significant, isn't it, that in, I think it's 1999, that CMS gets its own division of the US Academy of Management, which, as we know, and I expect many of the listeners would know, is, the biggest and most important academic interest group representing management academics. And, they wouldn't have let CMS in if they thought that CMS was particularly challenging. It wasn't.
Was a real threat, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It is. It's a form of tolerance. I think it was Marcuse who talked about that idea of kind of soft fascism or something, didn't he? This sort of notion that effectively by tolerating things that don't really matter very much, you're demonstrating what a benign and wise leader you are.
Yeah. So coming back to the B school, historically there seems to be a widespread misunderstanding that the B school began in America, starting with Wharton in 1833, but that's not at all the case, is it?
No, the earliest business schools are kind of European merchant schools, really. I mean, it depends how you work this stuff
how you
through.
define it,
but, effectively, I think what we know as the contemporary business school emerges in the beginning of the 19th century, particularly in some Northern European cities, as a kind of way of educating merchants in, cost accounting and stuff like that. And it would be really interesting to know more about that kind of history, because they sound like they were quite intriguing places, and that they were kind of pushing a slightly different version of what education was, but in terms of professional socialization and so on. But also sounds like they were quite international places, that these were kind of merchants, emergent businessmen from a wide variety of European countries who were studying in these places. But that kind of history is really is effaced. It basically, it's not that. I think there's a great deal known about it compared to places like Wharton and Harvard and Penn and all the rest of them. The big US business schools, which pretty much define the terrain, I think, and then kind of get re-imported to Europe, because I've been doing some reading on this recently. When in the 1960s, the UK government decides it needs to educate managers in order to become more internationally competitive and various other things, it's Harvard and Wharton that they turn to as their examples, and particularly the case study method as a way of suggesting that the best forms of management education and training existed in the States, and consequently that's what we should be attempting to copy in the UK.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable that when I was reading Shut Down the Business School, that even like in 1936, there were already 200 business schools in the United States. And as of 2013, the count was 13,000 worldwide.
That's right. Yeah.
Incredible number of people, both employed and produced by the B School.
Yeah. And it's an astonishing industry now, worth hundreds and hundreds of $1 billion. I've tried to do some stats on this stuff. So if you look in the UK, something like 1 in 7 students now doing some variant of business management. If you look at those stats within Europe, it's about 1 in 5. Mm-hmm. And if you try and look at these stats globally, it's about 1 in 4, although, the stats are not good. So there's a sense, I think, in which business management is now becoming a kind of hegemonic form of knowledge for the global university system.
Right.
In virtually every country in the world, it's becoming a particular kind of a form of knowledge, which I don't think we've probably seen in universities since the medieval period, when people used to teach about angels dancing on pins and so on.
Yeah.
But it really is. It's a remarkable kind of dominance that we can witness now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll talk more about that too. And MBA programs and executive MBA programs aren't quite as popular as they were maybe a decade ago, but they're still, the top ones are still charging an exorbitant amount of money. I think you made some conservative estimate that globally B schools have a kind of a gross income of $400 billion, which is astounding.
Yeah, and that's an estimate based on figures from quite a few years ago as well. So I assume we can go north from that a bit now.
Yeah, and then you add in the textbook publishers and everything else.
Yeah.
A lot of popular press over the years has taken aim at the MBA programs. About more bad advice and mediocre but arrogant. Masters of bureaucratic administration, master bullshit artists, the list goes on. So there have been a lot of hand-wringing about B schools and how they need to be reformed, and that the curriculum is either, too academic or not relevant enough. Some critics are advocating B schools need to become more focused on ethics and sustainability. Mm-hmm. Others are calling for the purging of the exclusive focus on maximizing shareholder value. And some of these criticisms have come from external commissions, but like we've been talking about, a lot of them have come from insiders, the majority of it, in fact. And you make a comment in the book that among some of these critics, there seems to be some sort of nostalgic yearning for the B school of the past, right? When supposedly B schools were trusted institutions, and that prior to World War II, they were more more ethical, perhaps. And whether true or not, they shifted after World War II, and we see a shift more towards finance and economics
Yeah.
and operations research because of that Cold War period. And they became much more instrumental and technocratic.
Yeah.
That's when we begin hearing about departments like management science and that the production of technicians, basically management technocrats. Is it this shift to try to emulate a so-called scientific legitimacy one reason why the B schools have become the biggest enablers of corporate capitalism run amok?
I mean, I think there's an element of that, isn't there? I think in the kind of the post-war period, what we see right the way across the world is a kind of an assumption about technocracy and the possibility of a kind of rule by experts. And so much of the move into things like operations and finance and so on reflects that sort of notion that science can govern us more wisely, something along those lines. Of course, what becomes pretty clear by the 70s, 80s, and so on is this, these are very particular forms of science, and that they're very much focused on certain kinds of value to the detriment of other forms of value. So, primarily shareholder value rather than thinking about social value or environmental value or anything else, or, kind of common sense ways of thinking about value in a way. There's also, I think, something here about the way in which the business school becomes, particularly in Europe, slightly later on, a kind of a cash cow for the university. So earning unencumbered income, which was necessary in order to support what was at that time largely a state-funded set of higher education systems in Northwest Europe. So the business school provides a main line to a whole bunch of cash to keep the chemistry department open. And, that's probably not quite as significant in the States, where your HE system, higher education system, has always been more marketized historically. But in Europe, that's been a very rapid change, I think. I mean, particularly in the UK, where basically we've seen, during my lifetime, a move from a system where universities were almost entirely supported by the state to a system where they're now effectively trading in markets for students. Yeah, and that's been a big shift, and one that's been enabled both financially and, if you like, ideologically by the business school itself.
Mm-hmm. But we've seen a lot of calls for change and reform of B schools over the years as well. And I remember at one time, I think it was the Carnegie Commission report, there was this big kind of push that B schools should be drawing more from the humanities and the liberal arts. If you remember that period.
Yeah.
And I was really kind of enthused when I first read that. And I thought, well, maybe there's hope for some real change. And I recall quite a few years ago, that I was serving on a departmental committee to re-envision our management curriculum. And I tried to put this forward. I think even Peter Drucker at the time was saying something along those lines, that management's more of a liberal art than a science. And well, turns out nobody took my idea seriously. I was the lone ranger on that point.
Okay.
And the curriculum was revised in a completely opposite direction to be, quote, more relevant than more skill-based, essentially to create courses aimed at training students for getting their first job out of college. And so in a way, I felt that the management curriculum, and I think that's pretty much true across the board, have basically turned into a vocational feeder for entry-level managerial jobs in corporations.
Yeah.
And I think that was a real turning point for me in my career in terms of kind of a growing disillusionment with the teaching of management as a discipline. Yeah. But now maybe we don't even have that problem of turning to liberal arts and humanities, because in most public universities, those are disappearing anyway.
That's right. I mean, there was a new Carnegie report about, it's about 10 years ago now, I guess, which came to very similar kinds of conclusions and focuses, in a sense, on the cultivation of character, on the idea that exposure to the liberal arts of some description is a way of cultivating a particular set of virtues which will make you into a better manager. That would be the way that the argument would run. The problem is, of course, that most business schools don't want to hear that stuff. It's administratively very complicated and sometimes quite expensive to, get some kind of course on English literature or anthropology or whatever else taught to your business majors. And many other parts of the university are not keen to engage with the business school, which they already see as being, a bunch of schmucks who've basically sold out. So that's been, somewhat harder. But I think behind that is the question of, what's higher education for? So clearly, one of the roles that higher education has played in both our countries over the last century or so is something about the validation of the professions, whether we're talking about doctors or solicitors or clerics or architects or whatever else. So providing that kind of professional knowledge is entirely consonant with providing professional knowledge for managers. Yeah, there's no particular contradiction in there. But there's another tradition, isn't there? And particularly one that's, represented by certain forms of Northwest European snobbery, which is something about the idea of cultivating particular forms of character, of Bildung, is the German version of this, isn't it? Of a kind of vocation, if you like.
It reminds me a bit of Aristotle's virtue ethics as well.
Absolutely.
And getting back to this idea of ethics and character development, the MBA, we already kind of talked about that, but after the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, there was a lot of finger pointing at MBAs and B schools, and found it interesting that some business school deans were trying to blame the victims. The millions of people who were targets of predatory subprime mortgage loans. Yeah. And you make some really good points that having an MBA didn't seem to curtail or prevent risk-taking and unethical behaviors, that it may have actually contributed to it. But it seems like business schools want to have it both ways in some respect, because on the one hand, they'll boast how relevant they are to contributing to the global economy and how much impact they have. But on the other hand, when these business-related fiascos occur, they want to wash their hands of any responsibility.
Sure, that's right. Yeah.
And
that's always a good strategy, isn't it? Is to own the good stuff and get rid of the bad stuff. So yeah, of course. And it would be foolish, I think, to blame business schools for the ills of financialized capitalism. That doesn't make a lot of sense. We can't talk about the latest bank collapses as if they were the responsibility of Harvard Business School. But it would be equally foolish, I think, to deny that business schools have some kind of role in producing the forms of explanation, logic, ideology, and so on that support those kinds of activities. So in a sense, both extreme positions are probably wrong, and a more moderate one would be, well, of course they matter. It'd be kind of crazy if they didn't.
Yeah. And you also cite some surveys. I think a survey that compared MBA students to people who were imprisoned in low security prisons.
That's right, yes.
And found that the prisoners were more ethical.
Yeah. Well, I'm a bit dubious about that, because a lot of those, those kinds of surveys, entertaining though they are, end up, suggesting that the problem is the people who do the MBAs or something. And I think we've got to pull back from that and look at a system that encourages certain kinds of behavior.
Yeah, like cheating, for example. It's pretty well established that business school students seem to cheat more than students in other subjects. And
they imagine there's less at stake or something,
Yeah. Harvard Business School is the poster child of B schools. And, when I first came to San Francisco State, I actually came from a completely different kind of program in organizational development, which was a standalone master's program.
Okay.
So I was quite new to me to know that I had to teach Harvard Business School case studies, and they were all the rage back then anyway. But I really hated them. They were typically cases of some CEO of a Fortune 100 firm, and yet I was teaching mostly first-generation college students who were probably unlikely to ever get into that level of management, or very few. But it was an orthodoxy I had to follow, and that was kind of another nail in the proverbial coffin of my disenchantment. in the field of management.
Yeah.
So I struggled many years with this internal conflict, this kind of cognitive dissonance, since I was studying at that time environmental philosophy and ecology, and we didn't call it climate change back then. There was the environmental movement, and I felt this deep internal conflict of having to teach market managerialism and knowing full well that this unfettered corporate capitalism was destroying our planet. And I guess I was wondering if you have a sense that whether other management and business professors out there are also secretly suffering from this sort of internal conflict, or is it just one problem of mass delusion and denial in among our professional disciplines?
Yeah. As you were talking, I was just thinking about, I don't know, say somebody who works in an arms factory producing a piece of electronics that helps the cruise missile hit whatever it's supposed to hit. And there's a sense, people have written about this before, isn't there? If you're just part of this big machine, then of course it's relatively easy to disavow your responsibility for it, if you like, to kind of, all I do is teach accounting 101. It's like, that's my job. That's what pays my mortgage, that kind of thing. So I think there's all sorts of ways in which people can almost kind of neutralize their agency within these kinds of organizations. At the same time, I do know, obviously I know lots of disaffected business school professors, which doesn't stop them from, being good in classrooms and writing good stuff and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But they're clearly people who do not share the hyperbolic vision of their deans, who, claiming that they're producing change makers or whatever it might be.
Yeah. This reminds me of Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil, this notion of not taking responsibility. I'm just doing my job mentality.
Yeah.
And
But, we got a bunch of people who, let's say, good people who work in oil companies, for example, who presumably experience the same kind of cognitive dissonance. They're not blind to what the IPCC reports are saying. And I'm sure many of them are, enthusiastically trying to suggest that they are trying to move towards, sustainable zero carbon, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. Whilst in practice, their organizations continue to pump stuff into the environment that's going to kill many of us.
Yeah, I have a confession along those lines as well, because I used to do some consulting for Exxon Chemicals down in Baytown, Texas. But I do recall very vividly this one benzene chemist who I was sort of working closely with. And he kind of confided in me this cognitive dissonance that he was feeling. So it's a very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
So we have this.
This feels increasingly like your confessional, Ron. Perhaps we should kind of. I'll be the priest.
Interview. It's my exit interview.
I'll be the priest, and you just tell me things that you regret.
Very therapeutic. So we have all these ongoing criticisms over the years, right? But we seem to be, in the B school, just metabolizes those criticisms with, I think, like you said earlier, we haven't really brought into dialogue or into serious dialogue about the question: what is the purpose of the business school today in society, and especially in the face of all these meta crises the climate change, global inequality, weakening of democracy, deteriorating mental health. And yet, it seems like we're still beholden that we have to teach and do research on in the field of management and organizations where capitalism in the corporate form is just inevitable.
Yeah.
Why is that such a intractable kind of resistance there?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is the dominance of a particular organizational form, so the corporation, as the poster kid for capitalism. And it's that organizational form that very often provides the endowments, the case studies, the imaginary, if you like, for the business school as the kind of the great white shark of capitalism or something along those lines. The problem with that is that we are increasingly presented with a series of crises that the corporation is clearly unable to solve, despite all the kind of claims about, purpose-driven capitalism and CSR and all the rest of it. It seems blindingly obvious to me that if we simply focus on shareholder value, then we just get more of the same. We're not going to come anywhere near solving these kinds of problems. But as soon as you start to go there, you're raising questions of ownership and control, of governance, which are going to dethrone many of the conventional ideas about managerialism, about the wisdom of hierarchy, and the kind of strategizing that focuses on shareholder value to the exception of anything else. So these challenges are existential, I think, to the corporate form as it currently exists. I still find it, one of the things I teach about corporate social responsibility, and one of the things I try and emphasize is that corporate social responsibility is the solution that corporations want you to think is going to work. Yeah. Well, of course they would. That kind of makes sense. But as soon as you start talking about co-ops or partnerships or localization or whatever it might be, some kind of more green left solution, then of course corporations are going to push back against that. Why the hell wouldn't they? It's it's a direct attack on their business model.
Yeah. I'd like to come back to that point about corporate social responsibility and the notion that there's only one best way of organizing, and it's called the corporation. I'd like to circle back to that. But before we dive back into that, I think another problem here, probably more so in the United States, is just I think it's quite similar in the UK, but the demise of publicly funded universities, that governments have dramatically reduced funding support per state student, state appropriations, for example. When I went to the CSU as an undergraduate, I attended Sonoma State University back in the mid-'80s. And I think my student fees were like $400 US a year, resulting in the burgeoning student loan debt that we have here. And in response, as you mentioned earlier, the B schools became cash cows for many universities. So at one time, the university, I guess I'm talking more about the university in general now, but was a place where, maybe this is an idealized image, but where professors and academics could be shielded from the pressures of the market. And it seems now, though, that the logic of the market pervades all aspects of academia, affecting both professors and students alike. And we see the growth of academic managers and administrative services.
Yeah.
It seems now that education, particularly a degree in business, is seen as just another commodity in the marketplace. And then there's an attempt to make B schools appear that they're actually representing the community with advisory boards and so-called stakeholders, but it doesn't really seem that they represent society at large at all. And I wonder if you could comment a bit about how the business school, in your book, you say it's a parasite on the university as its host, and that indirectly this parasitic relationship is actually changing the university to become a corporate university.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, quite a few people have been, but on both sides of the pond, have been writing about this for the last 50 years or so. Indeed, somebody like Thorstein Veblen was writing about it a century ago. This idea that universities were increasingly becoming oriented towards the market. Now, there's an element of snobbery in that as well, of course, isn't there? This idea that there's something kind of vulgar about the trades, and what universities should be doing is pulling back to the kind of the spiritual, to the development of character and all the rest of it. And I would just want to acknowledge that before going on to say, well, yeah, in a sense, in my country, the universities have become business schools. They kind of inadvertently, in a way, but effectively they've been pushed, because of the withdrawal of state funding, into acting more and more as commercial organizations that are sensitive to their marketing, to their reputation, to their various forms of accounting, to their strategy, and so on. I was looking at, because I'm writing another piece, I was looking at the something about the organizational structure of Warwick University, which is generally, a university that was founded in 1965 and was one of the new new universities and very much shaped itself as the business university, if you like. Now, Warwick University is basically now a holding company for a whole series of quite lucrative enterprises, whether those are student rents or temporary employment services or job advertising for academics or whatever else. But basically, it's it's a small holding company now, which has a whole series of different kinds of interests. And many universities are effectively having to do something along those lines. This is a way of, as I usually rather glibly say, of keeping the chemistry department open. Yeah, in order to make this kind of money. But of course, that also requires that you trade in other kinds of ways as well. So in the UK, for example, given our sort of imperial fact and the idea, we happen to speak the same language as the Americans, that we can sell higher education globally. And, particularly in terms of selling to China, India, and West Africa, this has been massively lucrative and has effectively allowed the government to marketize universities because of that income stream that was coming in. It's a curious kind of epistemological imperialism, in a sense, in that, instead of invading another country and making sure they send us all their good stuff, now we just charge them for higher education instead.
Yeah, this corporate numbers and accounting and enrollments and income streams, buying real estate, the exploitation of adjunct professors for cheaper labor and reduction of tenure slots and all this, do more with less mentality. Even the language games now are within administration are pervaded by corporate speak. And
sure, that's right.
So much emphasis now on marketing and PR and image and campaigns. And it seems like the administrative cost of so-called doing business for education automatically
must be enormous.
Has skyrocketed.
Yeah. I remember I was sitting in a cinema in the UK in something, I think it's about 1993. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a university advertise. And it was an advert for De Montfort University, which was Leicester Polytechnic. And it had some strange narrative about a seal being rescued from a killer whale or something. But I remember just thinking, blimey, universities advertising, is that a thing? Because I've never seen one before. Now, it'd be interesting to know, and I've no idea how you would get this kind of figure, how much universities collectively in the UK spend on marketing. And of course, has to be paid for by student fees, doesn't it? But, we must be into billions by now.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And all the consultants as well that are brought in.
Yeah.
So corporate universities have become like transactional enterprises in a way, and administrators have become like marketers. We were talking about that just now, and that they want to please a customer, the so-called student satisfaction. And the buzzword around here is student success. And I think one of the fallouts of the corporatization of the university is, and I really can't stand this, is the student as customer. And it seems one of the stupidest ideas I've had to contend with over 33 years as an academic. Please tell me what's wrong with that formulation.
The student as customer. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I suppose in order to understand that, we'd almost need to begin with the idea that universities are not the same as regular commercial enterprises. In other words, that their relationship to their clients, inverted commas, is not necessarily the same as somebody who's going to a shop and buying a tin of beans. And of course, that's in itself, by some people, seen to be quite an elitist thing to say, isn't it? This idea that there's this distinctiveness there. But if you push it back to, say, talking about their kids in, primary and secondary school and so on, then I don't think they would be articulating the relationship between their children and their school teacher as one of a customer and provider.
Right.
I assume that there's something else going on, some sort of theories about human development, about kids to be civil, about informing them about the variety of ways in which human beings live on this planet and so on. It's not as simple as just saying, if the kid leaves school happy, then somehow you've done the right thing. And I assume that universities have more in common with schools than they do with, let's say, And that means that the kind of relationship that they've got with their clients, their customers, their students, is not simply one in which you make them happy. Your aim is not student satisfaction. Your aim is education, which hopefully will lead to a life which is more fully lived. But it's not the same as simply making people happy. It's one of the things that kind of annoys me a bit when we use these student satisfaction sheets after lectures and courses and so on. And I don't think you don't need to be a genius to think that just because you've made students happy doesn't necessarily mean that good teaching has happened in the classroom. Yeah,
Yeah, that's for sure.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's a pretty poor measure. So I kind of feel, and again, this does, some people would articulate this as quite old-fashioned or elitist or something like that, that there is something distinctive, something rather special about the relationship between the student and the teacher, the professor, the lecturer, which can't simply be reduced to a customer-provider relationship.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're in that comparison to primary schools, and that we wouldn't expect children to get their education off TikTok or off the internet. That actually is something valuable going on in those schools, and
Yeah.
so yeah, I like that, and maybe this also has a lot to do with, or some parallel to the corporate colonization of the university. The B school logic itself seems to have infected the university at large, which over time has transformed our view of what counts as knowledge. Whether it's in the classroom or whether it's in publishing.
Yeah.
That it seems like you're saying, the University of Walmart is knowledge that has the buzzword is relevant or that can be sold. Can you elaborate on that too?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the growth of business schools in the States and, well, in North America in general and in Western Europe over the last 20 or 30 years has been the way in which that logic, a sort of business school logic, has come to colonize the rest of the university sector. And there's sort of two ways in which this is important, I think. One is numerically, because, of course, we know that the biggest subject being taught in higher education globally is business and management, which takes something like between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 of students globally now. So it's a huge form of knowledge in itself. So just as it's become the dominant discipline, I think so too has it become the operating system for global higher education. It's become a way of thinking about what global higher education is and does and should be. And it's based on the idea, pretty much what we were exploring earlier, that the product of the university system should be one that leads to very direct benefits in terms of the kinds of career aspirations of students or something along those lines. Now, that's okay so far as it goes. And I'm certainly not going to defend any form of higher education that has no relevance to the career benefits of the young people who might be entering it. But at the same time, if we reduce the complicated process of human life to individual benefit, I think we're kind of missing something. And we're certainly not going to be able to deal with the very complex challenges that face us in the future. Another way of saying that is to say that I think that higher education is producing a particular kind of citizen, a certain kind of person, and that person, I believe, needs to be cultivated in order to understand the collective nature of the challenges that face us and the often quite complicated and challenging ways in which we're going to need to rethink the economy in order to deal with the challenges that face us. And if we simply assume this is about individual benefit, we're not going to get very far.
Yeah, I'd like to return to that theme in a bit. But first, I'd like to circle back to the term management. And you devote a lot in your book that B schools have acted as sort of, the quote, the loudspeaker for one particular form of life, market managerial capitalism. And that brings us to some questions around what is management anyway. And your chapter really goes deep into the historical evolution of the term management.
Yeah. It's a
Even going back to
fascinating
the
point.
even going back to the even going back to the writings of Shakespeare.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. 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 So, I mean, the earliest sort of, as far as I can track it down, the earliest occurrences of the word management, which is, it comes from some idea of many techniques of the hand or something along those lines,
Mm-hmm.
are to do with a certain kind of cunning or capability to deal with complicated circumstances. This is what we find in Shakespeare in the 16th century. Um, what seems to happen by about the 19th century is that both in North America and in Europe, the term management has congealed from being a particular kind of capacity that certain people might have to deal with complex circumstances to become a cadre of people who effectively organize production on behalf of owners, something along those lines. And
Mm-hmm.
what's remarkable, I think, in the kind of the intervening period, really the sort of from the sort of mid 19th century onwards, is the extent to which that particular group, that particular occupation, has become so central and so celebrated in the sort of the fantasies of mature capitalism that we live with right now, to the extent that it's almost impossible to imagine organizations without managers, as if managers were a kind of magic fairy dust who could be sprinkled on any particular enterprise, any sort of project, and somehow make it go better. A general purpose technology of organizing or something. And this is, quite a good story for managers to tell about themselves, after all.
Yeah.
That they're very, very useful and very central. Well, of course, they would say that, wouldn't they? But it's effectively what business schools recite, is this kind of assumption about centrality. And by default, I think, an assumption that the rest of us, those of us who are not managers, are too stupid to manage ourselves, that we need managers, because without the manager, we would be like headless chickens, just running around, squeaking, bumping into each other and making a mess of things.
Right. So we've come to understand management as somehow absolutely necessary to all
That's right.
organizations. It's simply a given. And so we've been educated and led to believe that managers are so very special. And I think what's happened along the way, too, as you're pointing out, is that there was this separation of thinking and planning from doing, right? There was this severance, so to
Yeah.
speak, and this special claim of mastery, which managers have and business schools have contributed to.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a remarkable claim to centrality, isn't it? And we've seen similar kinds of movements like that. If you think about the medical profession or the legal profession, for example, or academics themselves, who've made professional claims, collectively made professional claims about their centrality. The difference for management is it's a kind of general purpose claim for an entire class of employees.
Yeah.
Which is rather different to the kind of specific claim that, say, doctors would make about their centrality to medicine, to hospitals, and so on.
Yeah. There's no really agreed upon form of expertise or body of knowledge, unlike physicians or lawyers and
Absolutely.
psychotherapists.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there've been various attempts to think about how you might professionalize management, but as a whole bunch of people have argued, it's not really very easy to think about what the core skills of management might be in other than the most vague terms. It's kind of motherhood and apple pie statements about leaders, about charisma, about administration or something like that. Most of the definitions of management simply wouldn't pass muster as the definitions of a profession.
Yeah, there's a famous saying that we're all familiar with, is that it was a Jameson, or maybe it's not Jameson, but it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capital. We might as well just say it's now harder to imagine the end of the world than the end of management.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah.
But you're pointing out that being against management is not the same as being against managery.
Managery, that's right. Yeah, which was the kind of the Elizabethan term for that kind of skill. I think managery almost translates best as something like coping. Yeah. So in Shakespeare, for example, being skilled in managery effectively means that you are capable of dealing with complicated adverse circumstances. Something like cunning, almost, that kind of word. Um, but it has now effectively been reduced to the activity of management.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. When I was, many years ago now, and I was sort of Googling the term management and noticing just how often it comes up in other contexts too. So when you talk about, say, managing your family or managing your sex life or managing your career or whatever it might be, that almost this idea that there is a general purpose technology that we can all use in order to make all aspects of our life better. And that strikes me as kind of dangerously lacking in nuance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And you also make a very strong case that B schools, B schools have gotten this general idea of management sort of wrong, and that management and organization are not the same. That business schools really don't take the problem of organizing seriously enough.
Yeah.
And one of the big problems of B schools is that they teach capitalism and the inevitability of the corporate form.
Yeah.
So can you elaborate more on this
Yeah,
criticism?
certainly. I mean, it's probably in the Against Business Schools book, it's probably the most important part of the argument, really, is to kind of distinguish between a specific form of organization we might call management and the general problem of organizing. Because, of course, there are many examples of forms of organizing that do not require managers. And many of them, like co-ops and partnerships and mutualism and all the rest of it, are successful organizations in themselves, but they don't require a full-time cadre of, business school qualified MBAs in order to do their business. So it seems to me that it's really important that we think about the problem of organizing as being a more generous and open way of articulating the problem that faces us, rather than restricting it to thinking about management, which after all is something carried on by managers with certain kinds of qualifications, abilities, and assumptions about hierarchy and so on. So yeah, I mean that's really crucial for me. But I think one of the arguments I make is that we should be closing down the business schools and opening schools for organizing,
Mm-hmm.
and almost kind of assuming that all bets are off in that sense, that when we talk about organizing, we might be talking about lots of different forms, lots of different ways of imagining how we might solve the collective problems that face us. And some of those might involve managers, but many of them might not. Yeah,
Right.
many of them might involve us coming together collectively to self-organize to solve the problems. And the most obvious way in which you can articulate this, because it's normally met with a certain degree of skepticism, is by talking about the worker co-op movement,
Oh, yeah.
which is one in which has been, going for centuries. Successful. These are successful businesses. They're not charities. And they're places that very often have rotating forms of administration and leadership that don't assume that one category of people somehow have more expertise than others, and in which very often, I can cite examples of worker co-ops in my country, where everybody is effectively paid the same because they're assumed to have the same kind of skills and capacities to help the organization with, rather than certain people having more expertise than others.
Well, I like how you draw from the etymology of words and terms and the Greek word organa or
Oh, yeah.
organon. And then it wasn't until, the 19th century that somehow the term organization solidifies into
Mm.
an actual institution.
Mm.
That's
Yeah.
very interesting too. And
Yeah.
so, okay, so it seems that one of the conundrums or challenges of bulldozing the B school and erecting a new school or new schools of organizing is that what students really want? I mean, most business students that we have taught that come to the university, either they simply want a degree as a ticket to their first job or a good job. And why would students want to study at a school for organizing? I mean, you even ask rhetorically, uh, who would launch a product that so few people wanted to buy?
That's right. Yeah. And it kind of goes back to that question of what's the relationship between the university and the student, doesn't
It
it? So,
does, yes, yes.
if we assume that students know best, and that and that business schools are promising them high salaries and access to the executive washroom and first class lounges and airports and all the rest of it, then of course any rational being is going to choose that kind of stuff, aren't they? They're going to get the business school qualification because they've been implicitly promised that that will lead them to a fantastic job, career, and so on. The problem is that that's not the world we live in. We live in a world of environmental and ecological crisis, which is only going to get worse. This is not looking good for us. So clearly, we need a different kind of system of production and consumption in order to produce a livable planet. We also live on a planet which is extraordinarily divided within and between nations. In which some people are as rich as the Egyptian pharaohs, whilst other people don't have enough to eat. And thirdly, we seem to be living in a planet now in which insular and populist politics is playing an ever greater role and threatening all of us in a variety of ways, whether we're talking about Putin or Trump or Boris Johnson or any of those characters. Now, given that kind of context, it seems to me that it's irresponsible to be promising students the executive jet. Yeah. What we should be talking about is how do we collectively produce an economy that guarantees us, well, not guarantees us, that provides us with a chance of having a livable planet in future. Now, if you give people that choice, I think they will opt for the School of Organising. But it does require that universities are much less marketing driven than they are at present. Yeah. And, most business schools are dreadfully guilty of this sort of stuff, in which, for if you look on their websites and so on, in which they're kind of promising the earth, promising graduate salaries and masters of the universe identities and all the rest of it.
Right.
And that seems to me just so irresponsible, really, really reprehensible. When actually they should be doing no more than telling people the truth. This is, these are critical times. And if higher education is going to be fit for those critical times, and if students are going to be helpful in that regard, they're going to become the solution rather than the problem, then we need a different kind of business education.
I totally agree. And now it's time for my rant. No, I think you're making an incredibly important and serious point that the business school, the B school, is a site of tremendous leverage for global change. There's no doubt. You make those points throughout your book. And you also make the point that, look, students aren't stupid. Professors aren't stupid. Well, even some administrators aren't stupid, but and they could see the handwriting on the wall, the extreme weather patterns, climate change. Come on. And so it seems that what we're dealing with, not only with the marketing seduction there, but it seems that one of the huge issues here is how the hidden curriculum is going unchallenged in B schools. And that, as we've been talking about, that foundational ideology of capitalist realism is writ large across and taught across all the B school disciplines, with finance and economics and HR, marketing, information systems, so on. And you make a really good point that there's this inherent sort of pressure to reproduce this corporate form of the B school. And here's where my rant comes in, is that, all these B schools, including my own, now have their obligatory fashionable add-on modules in business ethics and certificates in sustainability and corporate social responsibility. In fact, I think this week at San Francisco State is our annual ethics week.
Congratulations. It's always good to have a week on ethics.
Yeah. But students really don't have any kind of clue that, that there are other options, as we're talking about the School of Organizing. And despite all these well-intentioned courses and programs, that we still don't seem to actually question the fundamental assumption of corporate managerialism as the basic kind of exclusive organizing principle for the entire globe. Yeah. And instead, students are taught at best that, they can work within the system. Well, try to affect, incremental change, maybe at best some sort of reform, And it's as if the CSR, business ethics, sustainability certificates function like a Trojan horse.
Mm-hmm.
We can get these started, but it seems like it's just putting lipstick on a pig to me.
Poor pig. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And
What?
so, where do we go from here then?
Yeah. What seems kind of sad, well, I mean, not exactly sad, but tragic, I
Yeah,
guess, is that
tragic.
many of the young students that I teach here at the University of Bristol understand the nature of the problems that we face. They are not, they've been well educated in the problems of climate change. They understand something about global inequality. They know that big tech lies to them all the time, etc. They're highly suspicious of authority and so on. What they don't know is what to do about it. So when I start talking to them about alternative business forms, about localization of production, about understanding mutual finance and so on, these things are very often news to them, and hopefully they provide my students with the idea that it is possible to organize our way out of the problems that face us. So that seems to me the real possibility here, that business schools could be, rather than being for you and I, a kind of lightning rod for all the worst things about neoliberalism and higher education, that they could be incredibly important sites for reimagining our economic system. But not if we just imagine it as, an ethics module or something. This has to involve reimagining all parts of the business school, including accounting and finance and operations and all the rest of it, because it's the model itself, the entire model of global capitalism that's the problem, not just adding ethics and purpose to what's already going on.
And in your retrospective article on Against Management,
mm-hmm.
the book you wrote some 20 years ago,
yeah.
you end this article with a provisional manifesto for a school of organizing. And
yes,
there are some really, really key points there. I mean, do you want to talk just about a few and that are really central to your thinking?
Sure. I mean, I can't remember all 10, to be frank.
Of course, just a few central.
Yeah.
points.
I mean, one of them, the one that I keep on rattling on about, is the idea that there should be no modules at business schools that are taught without reference to carbon reduction.
Yeah.
In other words, you're simply not allowed to teach about corporate finance or international operations management without talking about how this discipline contributes to the reduction of emitted carbon, or indeed of other externalities like ecological damage and so on. That should simply be a mandate. It's as simple as that. And I don't care about academic freedom in this regard. This is the key problem that faces us.
Right, yeah.
So stuff like that seems to be, to me, really, really important. The other aspect of this, which I've got more and more interested in, I suppose, is not to be thinking about business schools engaged in a kind of international competition for who's the best business school on the planet, but rather turning them to the particular problems of their localities. And I think in the manifesto thing, I talk a little bit about how to involve local students and businesses and local government and so on in the governance of those business schools, in order to make sure that they are directly relevant to the cities and city regions that they're part of, rather than engaged in this sort of epistemological arms race, which is undertaken via various sort of dubious league tables that demonstrate that, to students that Harvard is the best and, whatever, Penn is the next or whatever it is.
The rankings and all the magazines and so. Yeah. Well, I visited Bristol in 2019. I was on my own book tour and gave a talk there. And it seems like quite a hotbed of radicalism and activism.
It's a really interesting city with an awful lot of kind of green and red things going on, particularly green. There's lots of interesting green institutions here and a variety of ways in which the city, in confused and hesitant ways, is trying to restructure itself in order to think about how to produce a fairer, more democratic, low carbon economy.
Yeah, and you sort of point in the direction that, looking back 20 years ago, that we were so concerned of getting published and putting a lot of words on paper, but that we should actually be doing something as academics. Yeah. And so what are you doing now that is different from where you were 20 years ago in that respect, within the context of Bristol?
Yeah. So there's a variety of things I've been involved in since I've arrived here. I mean, much of my career, like most academics, I've just spilt oceans of ink, writing various books and articles that nobody's ever read. I'm still doing some of that. I haven't stopped that entirely. But I've now got involved with a series of projects which hopefully are linking the university to the city in more direct ways. I'm particularly thinking about ways in which the sorts of resources and perhaps even expertise that we have here at the university could be of use to people who are thinking about different forms of ownership and control, different ways of imagining energy production or transport or whatever it might be in the city. Because it seems to me that's so important, that universities have become ever more kind of sequestered, separated from their contexts. Certainly in the UK, are more engaged in this kind of competition with each other. I used to joke that the only thing that, rather the only thing that kind of linked the University of Bristol to the city was the coincidence about the name, pretty much, because the University of Bristol really didn't have much to do with the city of Bristol beyond inflicting higher house prices on most of its residents. I think that we have changes in that regard now in a variety of British universities, but they're slow and they need to happen more rapidly. So I kind of argue now for the localization of the university as well as being one of the ways in which it might be made into a more useful institution in order to deal with the challenges that face us.
Martin Parker, thank you.
A pleasure. Thanks very much for talking to me, Ron.
This is the Mindful Cranks podcast. I hope you like our new look and feel, and check out our webpage at www.mindfulcranks.com. And subscribe to the Cranks newsletter to learn about upcoming guests and other events. The Mindful Cranks is pretty much on every podcast platform. Please rate and review the show on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you are so inclined. That's it for now. I'll be back soon with another amazing guest. Thanks for listening.